Thank you very much, Andrew. That's quite an introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not sure whether I speak to you this morning as a Conservative ANU economics graduate or as a social progressive, but maybe a little bit of both, and that's an important part of, as Andrew said, the mix that's necessary to make Canberra successful. Can I begin this morning by acknowledging that we're gathered on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to thank CEDA very much for the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you this morning outlining where Canberra is at the moment and our city's future direction. Now, should the PowerPoint be working? I'm conscious that another Treasurer stood in this very spot just this week and spoke for 46 minutes about nothing. I promise you I will not do that. I want to give a brief overview of the major priorities for my government at this time, and then give you a bit of an insight into where I see the Territory's economic future and the possibilities, I think brilliant possibilities that lie ahead for the City of Canberra. So as a simple opening statement for my government, it's a truism for Canberra: unless we are leading national policy reforms, our economy and our city will fall behind. We simply have to be running full pace just almost to stand still in the global economy. But in the context of Canberra's role in Australia, we simply have to be the nation's leader, the nation's innovator in bringing new policy and world-leading policy to the table and then being able to quickly implement it. And that is a great comparative advantage that this city has. One level of government, combining local and state functions, an economy big enough for these sorts of reforms to be noticed, for it to make a difference, but small enough to be able to implement the reforms quickly and effectively. My focus, my government's focus, will always be on delivering essential services to this community, but it also needs to be being the nation's incubator for good policy. And that must be at the forefront of the thinking of any ACT government. Reform is vital. The discussions that have been had in this room and other rooms across the nation about the need for the Australian economy to reform, to adapt, and for there to be political leadership to achieve that seem to be the entire purpose of the change in Prime Minister last year. So far, I'm afraid we've not really seen any significant change in economic policy direction. It's falling to the states and territories to be the innovators in this country at this time. Now, I hope that changes, but the evidence to date is that the shortness of the federal political cycle, the nature of public policy debate in this country at this time, seems to make it very difficult to achieve reform at a federal level. I put part of that down to the fact that they are seemingly permanently locked in an election cycle, that changes of leadership, short parliamentary terms, make it difficult to build the case for reform. But then I also would say that there's a fundamental lack of passion and desire to expend a little bit of political capital in order to get a better outcome for the community at a federal level. I don't think that criticism is fairly levelled at the state and territory level, though, in most circumstances. So for Canberra, what does it mean? It means that we need to run faster and harder in those areas where we have a comparative advantage, and we need to be at the forefront of policy innovation. Our economy will always be narrower than many other parts of Australia, but we do have key comparative advantages that we need to ensure we are taking advantage of. And for us, that is around our human capital. We have the best educated workforce in Australia. We have the highest level of engagement in those sectors of the Australian economy that are going to be growing rapidly. So Canberra's future is one of deep engagement in internationally tradable services. That's our city's future, but we are well placed to take advantage of that. Part of the story, though, also is about the livability of a city. You can't attract and retain talent if your city is not a great place to live. and Canberra will always be at a disadvantage compared with the larger cities in Australia. But we can make up for that in many ways, and that's exactly what my government's seeking to do. So, a quick run through the stats at this point in time. Most people would be aware Territory economy suffered a significant hit upon the change of government in 2013. But we have seen a modest recovery in the period beyond that first horror federal budget in 2014. Gross state product modestly improving and projected into the future to do a little better. It's worth reminding people that the Territory economy is larger than Tasmania's. That's a point that I like to make at COAG forums so that I don't get shoved all the way to the end of the considerations. And we are growing and growing faster than Tasmania. Our unemployment levels have been consistently below the national average, but have been trending up a little. The Commonwealth cut 3% of total employment in the Territory economy. Now that is 2 to 3 times the impact of some of the more significant employer shutdowns in other parts of Australia. Think manufacturing, car industry and the like in different parts of Australia. That was, in those economies, 1 to 1.5%. Here we lost 3% of our employment. It's an extraordinary hit to take, but one that we have rebounded strongly from, and the most recent figures released just yesterday show that we're now at an all-time high in terms of Territory history, the number of people in employment in Canberra. It's testimony to the strength of other sectors of our economy and the fact that there was a little bit of respite in the 2015 Commonwealth budget. Retail trade, a good early indicator of what's going on in the economy. The trough that you see that I've referred to as peak Abbott was when things really got bad in Canberra, but as you can see, after that initial shock, particularly when I extracted the commitment from the then Prime Minister that there'd be no further cuts in Canberra and that the worst was behind us, we started to see quite a sharp recovery in consumer sentiment. So what happens in this city is that people pay attention to politicians more than anywhere else in Australia, and they're particularly attuned to what's said at a federal level. And that does impact upon consumer confidence in Canberra, a point I've made to the new Prime Minister. Residential building approvals, another indicator of economic activity, tend to have big peaks and troughs based upon large multi-unit construction. So I think it's important to know that whilst that looks a bit like a roller coaster, that the peaks will reflect a large unit complex being completed or approved in this instance. And so you do see peaks and troughs there, but by and large, more volatility in the ACT, but impacted by those large one-off developments. Commencements again, showing a similar story. Generally speaking, when the Australian economy is performing well, when there's confidence in the national government, Canberra's economy performs very well. Probably a key indicator here, though, in terms of the largest employer in the city is the level of Commonwealth public sector employment in Canberra. You see over history that the longer a government is in office, the Commonwealth level, seemingly regardless of whether it's a Labor government or a Liberal government, the longer they are in office, the more they increase the size of the Commonwealth public service. So putting politics aside, one of the better things that can happen for Canberra's economy is a bit of stability at a federal government level. So all of this paints the picture of an economy that is turning the corner, that is less reliant on decisions of the Commonwealth government, but still heavily impacted by that. And I think that will be the case for Canberra in all of our lifetimes. And let's face it, this city is Australia's greatest regional development success. It's 103 years old this year. It's only had its own government for about 25 years. It's only had its own economic development agenda for a period perhaps even less than that. So we start 2 centuries behind a number of other Australian cities in terms of our own direct engagement in our city's economic development. But we want to ensure that we are focused on that national and international engagement into the future. One key element of that is ensuring that we are able to attract and retain quality people in our city in many different fields of endeavour. One element of this international engagement that I'm sure you'll be hearing a little bit more about later today is the stunning success of getting direct international flights to Canberra. This is, I think, the single biggest economic game changer for this city in the history of self-government. This opens up so many opportunities for so many sectors of the ACT economy and the broader region. And it was really encouraging a week ago to be speaking at a freight symposium with more than 100 people from all around the region who will now utilise Canberra Airport and the services that Singapore Airlines will be offering as their way of getting their goods into Southeast Asia in a much more effective way than having to go through Sydney. And I'm sure Stephen Byron will talk at great length about this later this afternoon. Clearly, infrastructure is a priority at all levels of government. There's a lot of talk about it, not a huge amount of delivery in some parts of the country. I think the ACT is again proving to be a shining example of what is possible when you utilise all of the policy levers that are available when state and territory governments engage with the Commonwealth. So just in the last 12 months, we were the first jurisdiction to sign up to the Commonwealth's Asset Recycling Initiative, and we are the beneficiaries of a large Commonwealth contribution to our light rail project. So I consider that actually not a bad outcome to have got Tony Abbott to agree to invest in an urban rail project. Now, the new Prime Minister is even more passionate about urban rail. He's a regular tweeter every time he rides light rail. He has just recently made a Commonwealth contribution to the second stage of the Queensland, the Gold Coast light rail project. My first meeting with the Prime Minister, about 2/3 of it, was spent poring over where light rail will go in Canberra. So he is interested in this, invited my government to put forward a submission to the Commonwealth for the next stage of Canberra's light rail development. We're particularly interested in working with the Commonwealth in relation to possible extension to the Russell Defence Precinct and the Parliamentary Triangle, where the Commonwealth is a major landholder and a major employer and would stand to benefit significantly from the extension of that public transport service. We've also entered into the Territory's first public-private partnerships, the first being our new courts project in the west of the city. We have a significant public hospital project underway on the University of Canberra campus, the largest single renewal of our city's public housing stock in the history of self-government, and a significant package of other transport upgrades as part of the largest ever infrastructure program for the Territory. So actually getting on with it, in spite of a degree of political controversy over some of the projects, but I stress only some of them, not all of them, and it's encouraging to see the willingness of the Canberra infrastructure community and the Canberra community more broadly for government investment at this time in our city's infrastructure. Clearly, the controversial project, though, is the light rail project. We have selected, after an extensive and thorough process, a preferred consortia to deliver the project as a public-private partnership. I've announced the establishment of Transport Canberra, our single coordinating transport agency, to integrate light rail with the city's bus network. One agency delivering one transport network, one ticketing system, a simpler and more efficient public transport network for Canberra. As an aside, and pointing again to the agility of the ACT government, we were the first jurisdiction in Australia, and the first in the world, I understand, to regulate the arrival of ride sharing into our city before services established, creating a framework for companies like Uber, but not limited to Uber, because we've had other entrants now, to come in and provide better transport services for Canberrans. Boosting the supply of demand-responsive transport at a lower cost. One of the more significant reforms that was subsequently followed by New South Wales, and I understand Western Australia, with other jurisdictions needing to look at this. A case study of how our government can be innovative, agile, and respond quickly inside 9 months to get in place a framework that other jurisdictions are now following. Part of our government's agenda is to ensure that our regulatory framework, our taxation arrangements, and our planning system are investor-friendly, encourage new enterprises to establish in our city, and to support those that are already establishing to grow more quickly. We've seen a significant new injection of capital into Canberra. And Canberra, like Australia, will need to be, for the foreseeable future, a net importer of capital. Our economy simply isn't large enough to generate all of the capital that's necessary to meet our city's growing needs. So I've been a regular feature in national and international boardrooms, various fora drumming up new investment for the city. And we've seen that in a number of instances, and we will continue that approach. Regulatory reform is critical, and this is again a comparative advantage that the ACT has, combining both local and state government functions, makes the investment pathway, the business pathway, much, much easier in this city. And by establishing Access Canberra, where I've pulled all of the different arms of ACT government that had a regulatory function together, we're seeking to further streamline our approach to regulation to be nation-leading, to encourage innovation, and to find, in the simplest of terms, 100 reasons why something will happen, not 100 reasons why it won't. I've established Invest Canberra to boost our trade and investment effort, both in terms of attracting new investment into the city, but also having a major focus on exports for the ACT. I thought the New Zealand Prime Minister John Key put it well, that no small economy will grow rich and prosper by selling to itself. Canberra, perhaps even more so than the rest of Australia, needs to trade, needs to export in order to grow our economy. And that is a key priority for the government. The Singapore Airlines flights open up significant opportunities in areas that we haven't previously had, and we intend to pursue those. We've also established the Canberra Innovation Network as a way of encouraging startups and innovators with a range of key partners across the university sector and in other non-government areas, with very strong support from my government in order to boost this sector of the Territory's economy. Our other goal is to be Australia's leading digital city. We've got a way to go here, but the policy direction and the initial steps are encouraging. The response from the private sector has been equally encouraging, and that is our objective over the next 4 years, is to be Australia's leading digital city, and we're well on our way to having Australia's largest free public Wi-Fi network here in Canberra. Urban renewal, making this city a better place to live, meeting the challenges of a growing population. Canberra will hit 400,000 people this year. I think arguably our daytime and during the week population already exceeds that by a considerable number. But in the context of the official ABS figures, we'll reach 400,000. We're growing at around 1.5% to 2% annually. So the challenge for the city over the next 10 years in particular is where we will accommodate this population growth. And my government has determined very firmly that we need to meet at least half of that growth within the existing urban footprint of the city. And hence we have an extensive range of urban renewal projects underway. I'd like to see the CBD population move from about 3,500 to 4,000 to 20,000 over the next decade or so, and we've got the land release and sites available to achieve that in the next 5 to 10 years. Key element of this is, I think, one of the country's greatest urban development projects, one that presents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to address the greatest planning mistake made, or one of the greatest planning mistakes made in this city prior to self-government, and that was putting the major east-west arterial road, a 4 to 6 lane highway that cuts our city off from one of our greatest assets in Lake Burley-Griffin. So the City of the Lake project is a staged process that will address that physical barrier and provide a wonderful opportunity to better utilise one of our city's great assets. Too often in Canberra, we drive past at probably 10 or 20k over the speed limit and look out the window at these areas. There's very few people who use them. That has to change. Our city sometimes feels like it's designed for people who are 4 metres tall, or was designed by someone who was looking at it from 10,000 feet. It needs to be more about a human scale and about people utilising spaces, and that's exactly what this project will deliver. Just finally, tax reform, the big topic of the year. If Paul Keating was still regularly commenting, he would no doubt say that the resident galah in the pet shop would be talking about tax reform. But there's been a lot of talking about it, hasn't there? A lot of talking about it and not much doing. Well, we are about to complete the first of our first tranche of our tax reform, the first 5 years. We will abolish insurance tax on the 1st of July, becoming the first jurisdiction in Australia to do so. We're phasing out stamp duties that everyone agrees are bad taxes and transitioning towards a broad-based land tax. The Prime Minister was on the Insiders program, the first major political review of the year, and he not only endorsed the policy direction of my government, but our political courage in actually undertaking the reforms. And in light of what's happened in the last week or so, and other presentations in this place this week, it certainly does highlight a very clear contrast between those prepared to expend a little bit of political capital to do the right thing for their economy and for their people. Tax reform is difficult, everyone acknowledges that. But when a jurisdiction gets on and does it, I think it's very, very important for those who are advocates of this to get out and support it. And so I'll conclude with a very simple message to an august organisation like CEDA to say we are delivering on exactly what every economist says we should be doing, delivering on the agenda that the Prime Minister has outlined as necessary for this country, and we're doing it right here in Canberra. To a certain extent, I don't mind being the first because I think we get the greatest benefits of being the early adapters. But I have no doubt that what happens here will be closely examined elsewhere in the country. So it deserves national attention and it deserves the interest of policymakers around Australia. The benefits are very clear. In our 2016-17 budget that I'll deliver in June, we'll outline the next 5 years of tax reform in the ACT. Thank you very much.